For this video, I'd like to talk about factoring quadratics with a common factor. So with these problems, the first step you want to do is to find the greatest common factor of your three terms in this quadratic equation. And once you factored that out, then you can factor your quadratic normally, where the coefficient on x squared is just 1. And we'll essentially just use that reverse FOIL method, though there are other ways to approach it. So looking at these three terms, we need to figure out what the greatest common factor is, or what is the biggest number that divides evenly into all three terms. And we can start with the variables. Notice that these two have x's in it, but this constant term, this minus 48, there is no x. So we're not going to be able to factor an x out from all three of these, but we should be able to factor out a number from all three of these. So all three of these, we need to ask what is the biggest number that can divide into their coefficients. And my advice is to look at the smallest number and check that one first, because the bigger ones are not going to divide evenly into the smaller ones, so we can start small and work our way up. So the question is, does 4 or minus 4 divide into these other two terms? And 28 divided by 4 is just 7. And 48 divided by 4 is 12. So we can factor a minus 4 out from all three of these. The minus can come with us because all three terms are negative. So we're going to factor out that minus 4, and now we just need to know what is left. Or essentially, each of these terms is being divided by minus 4. So this one will just be x squared. Minus 4 divided by minus 4 is just 1. Minus 28 divided by minus 4 would be positive 7, so plus 7x. And minus 48 divided by minus 4, that'd be a positive 12. And once you get to this step, you want to check your work. So redistribute the minus 4 and see if you get back what you started with. And in this case, you would. But that way, you'll at least know that you're on the right track. Now, once you get to this step, once you've factored out this greatest common factor, then we need to factor this quadratic in its usual fashion. So I'm going to rewrite it as minus 4, and then we're going to have these two binomials multiplied together. Remember, binomials have two terms. So all quadratics can be factored like this as a product of these two binomials. And remember the FOIL method. So I'll just do a quick refresher. We have, let me use a different color here. Let's say we have x plus 2 times x minus 1. The FOIL just means multiply the first ones together, you get x squared. Multiply the outer ones, x and minus 1, to get minus 1x. And then the inner ones, 2 times x, so plus 2x. And then the last ones, plus 2 and minus 1 would be minus 2. Now, at this point, you can combine and simplify, but essentially, we're going to go from here back to this. So I refer to it as sort of a reverse FOIL method. But like I said, there are other ways to approach this type of problem and how to factor this. You can also use factoring by grouping. So if you watch that later video where we're dealing with coefficients on x that are not 1, so maybe you'd have a 2 or a 3 there. In that video, you learn how to factor with grouping, and that can actually be applied to this simpler quadratic as well, if you prefer that. But honestly, this is the method I always use in practice, so that's what I'll go through with you. And when we're factoring this one, so now we're back to our x squared plus 7x plus 12, we are going to do this process in reverse. So notice the first ones, x and x, give you the x squared term. So these first ones are going to have to be x and x. Since the coefficient on x is just 1, so we're not going to have like 2x or 3x there. It's just going to be 1x and 1x in each. And then notice the last ones, L, they give us our constant term. So the last ones multiply just to give us our number. So the last ones are going to multiply to give us 12. So this one and this one have to multiply to give us 12. And at this point, we just look at all the possibilities. What two numbers multiply to give you 12? It could be 1 and 12. It could be 2 and 6, or 3 and 4. Or you can have the negative versions of those. Minus 1 and minus 12, minus 2 and minus 6, and minus 3 and minus 4. So all 6 of these are possibilities. And then we use the outer and the inner to determine this middle term with x. Since notice, let me change colors again. For the outer and the inner, we did x and minus 1 and 2 and x. So that's this term and this term. And notice these are the terms with x in it. And they add up. Essentially, the outer and the inner will add up to give you this middle term. Because from here, you could actually simplify it further. This is just x squared plus 1x minus 2. And so the outer and the inner terms in this case added up to 1x. So it's the same process here. The outer and the inner terms have to add up to this 7x term here. And what we do next is just determine from these possibilities for essentially these two terms in our binomials, out of these 6 possibilities, which one of these would add up to positive 7x? And in this case, it would be the 3 and the 4. So if we do plus 3 and plus 4, this should be our factored form of the quadratic. But just like we did when we factored out the negative 4, we're going to check it. Like when you factor out the greatest common factor, you just redistribute it to see if you get what you started with. And that's how you can feel confident that you did it right. Now with these factored quadratics, you have to actually multiply it out using the FOIL method again, just to make sure that this is the correct form. So we use FOIL. X and x make x squared for our first ones. Then you do x and positive 4, so plus 4x. And then plus 3 and x would be plus 3x. And then plus 3 and plus 4 gives you positive 12. And notice the outer and the inner terms do add up to 7x. So we did get back what we started with, which means we can feel very confident that this is the correct answer here. So the general strategy, factor out your greatest common factor. And then once you get your quadratic, put it into its 2 binomials. I like to mark all 4 spaces there. And then just use this reverse FOIL method where the first ones will give you your x squared term. So that's just x and x. The last ones will give you your constant term. And we had to write out all those possibilities. And then the outer and the inner will give you your middle term. And so out of these possibilities for your numbers here, you ask which one of these would add up to the coefficient on x here. In this case, positive 7, so we had to use 3 and 4. And when we checked it, it did give us the correct answer, or at least it verified that this is the correct answer. So with that in mind, that strategy, we're going to use that for several more problems. So let's keep going. So we need to figure out, to start, what our greatest common factor is. And with all these problems, you're not going to be able to factor out an x because they're all going to have some constant term. So we just look at the numbers, and again, I'm going to look at the smallest number, 7 here. Does 7 divide evenly into the other two, 35 and 42? And it does. So we're going to factor out 7. You get x squared there. 35 divided by 7 is just 5, so you have 5x there. And 42 divided by 7 would be 6. And I encourage you to check this, pause the video, redistribute this, make sure that it does equal what we started with. And it does, so we'll continue. So I'm just going to rewrite the 7 and then put our 2 binomials. And I'm going to mark the 2 terms in each of those. And then again, we're just using that reverse FOIL method. So the first ones give you the x squared term. So that means that this will be x and this will be x because those multiply to give you x squared. And then the last ones will give you the constant term. So let me use a different color. So we need to ask what combination of 2 numbers can multiply to give you 6. And that could be 1 and 6 or 2 and 3. It could also be the negative numbers, -1 and -6 and -2 and -3. Sometimes you will have this negative case, especially if this is a negative number here. But if everything is positive, if everything is plus, 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 then you know that your terms are going to be positive. So the last step is that the outer and the inner add up to this 5x here. So out of these possibilities, which one of them adds up to the coefficient on x, which is just 5 in this case? And that would be 2 and 3. So we can put +2 and +3 there. And at this point, we just check it. We're going to re-multiply this out. I'll just carry the 7 down because we already know that The 7 is the correct greatest common factor, so we don't need to check that again. And we're going to FOIL this out. So x and x makes x squared. X and 3 makes 3x. And then the inner 2 and x makes 2x. And the last ones, 2 times 3 would be positive 6. And these do add up to 5, which means we can feel confident that this is, in fact, the right answer.